So my topic is African Theological Education, Retrospect and Prospect, a Francophone perspective. Talking about theological education in French-speaking Africa is a complex task, given the vastness of the continent and the diversity of its region and the plurality of experiences. The region called Francophone Africa comprises former French colonies, where French is the official language, and the language in which formal education is carried out. There are 11 countries officially recognized as Francophone, 8 in West Africa, 3 in Central Africa. So in West Africa, you have Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Senegal. In Central Africa, you have Congo, Gabon, and the DRC. You also have some countries where French is not the official language, but one of the official languages. So you have Cameroon, you have Central African Republic, and many others. The encounter between Christianity and the different countries of Francophone Africa took place at different times, and the educational systems inherited from the different colonial empires or imposed by them were also different. Though it is possible to isolate common features related to history, culture, religion, and education, the reality is Africa is not a monolithic entity, and Francophone Africa is no exception. We all know that. The diversity in theological education is reflected in the variety of theological institutions and theological initiatives across the region. Theological education in Francophone Africa, initiated by Western missionaries, has developed over the last 100 years and plus from non-formal theological education to university-level theological education. How did we get to where we are today? How did this development take place? What are some of the challenges facing theological education in Francophone Africa today? And how can these challenges be met? So these are a few questions I'm going to address in this presentation. In recent years, the number of theological education providers and agencies have considerably increased in Francophone Africa. There is a momentum in theological education. Churches, theological education institutions, and their partners have become aware of the central role that theological education plays in the rooting and growth of Christianity in the region, and have decided to join hands to transcend their individual weaknesses by gathering together in regional associations. So, it is argued that the future of theological education in Francophone Africa lies in part in strengthening these associations that are seeking to empower theological education institutions in areas such as curriculum development, government issues, and to encourage teacher exchange and research, and to oversee accreditation and faculty promotion. In this presentation, I will focus on Protestant and evangelical theological educations whose history and contributions are less known. I've identified 3 phases in the development of theological education in Francophone Africa, beginning from the 1900s to to the present age. Roughly speaking, I'm going to talk about the infancy of theological education, the formalization of theological education, and then ownership in theological education. Let me start with a brief historical survey that shows the chronology of how missionaries arrived in West Africa in general, especially in the Gulf of Guinea. So during the second half of the 19th century, Western missionaries were established in the Gulf of Guinea under territories, in the coastal territories under French, British, and German rule. I'm aware that Christianity began in Africa way before that. The first 5 centuries, and then we had the first wave in the 15th century, and then the 18th and 19th. So, but I'm focusing on the second half of the 19th century to the 20th century. The Christianization of Africa on the Protestant side was achieved through a great diversity of missionary organizations. I have a chart. I'm not able to present it here, but there are so many various mission agencies that came and in an effort to present the gospel to this region. Anglo-Saxon mission societies dominated the scene. On the 18 mission agencies that I have on my list, only 2 of them were originated from France. Just 2 among 18. So you can see how the ratio is. You have Methodists, Baptists, Anglicans, Presbyterians, the Assemblies of God, Christian and Missionary Alliance, etc. The diversity of missionary agencies matched the diversity of doctrinal positions. So, naturally, the churches that grew out of the missionaries' work were in turn characterized by a great doctrinal diversity. And so it is with Protestantism. In Francophone West Africa, mission agencies at some point realized that they needed to coordinate their efforts in order to be more efficient. So they set up a Protestant Council of French West Africa. So we learned this from an Ivorian historian, Célestin Kwasi. So in 1945, they put their strengths together and set up this council. But around maybe 15 or 20 years later, in 1960, this council, this federation broke up. It was swept along by political changes in the French colonies. So it was dissolved after the French West African territories voted overwhelmingly in favor of the 1958 referendum to join the Franco-African community. So the Protestant Federation that was put together by mission agencies disappeared with the dissolution of this part of West Africa that was under the French rule. In its place, national federations were created. So in those new independent countries, there were now different federations. This is important. I will come back to that later. But as I conclude this historical overview, It is important to notice that the unity of the missionary agencies was short-lived. They were not able to come up with new ideas to adjust to the new situation, to the new political environment. So an important lesson we can all learn from that short overview is that we have to adjust. In Francophone Africa and elsewhere in Africa, we must learn to adapt, we must learn to adjust, or we will perish. So now, let's move on to the infancy of theological education in Francophone Africa. As I said, this is characterized by informal and non-formal theological education, so starting from the early 1900s. Christian theological education in Francophone Africa started with the missionaries who first preached the gospel to the peoples in that region, as I said, in the late 19th century to the 20th century. This statement is not to say that theological endeavors began on the continent at that time. Indeed, the vitality of African Christianity and the vigor of its scholarship are widely attested. So names such as Origen, Tertullian, Augustine come to mind quickly. Ironically, around and after the Berlin Conference in 1884-85, many Protestant missions will set foot on the continent in the wake of the scramble for Africa. Christian theological education in French colonies will develop from the time the missionaries began their work of evangelization. So after establishing mission station, the missionaries worked out to convert the natives, often beginning with domestic workers, cooks, and other helpers. Andrew Schaeffer and Elie Sanon note that in the case of the CNMA, they used mission stations as basis from which they went out to evangelize in the surrounding areas. This strategy was adopted and used by many other mission agencies, like the Assemblies of God and others. The fact is, historically, the transmission of the gospel from Africans to Africans was a cooperative effort between the missionaries and the locals. And the role played by Africans in the spread of the gospel on the continent is attested by many. The so-called natives worked side by side with missionaries to proclaim the good news to their families, to their villages, and often beyond their borders. The contribution of these Africans to the growth of Christianity is widely documented and attested by respected scholars such as Lamine Sané, Bediako, and Titienu, to name just a few. Among the converts, some were selected to receive further training. So these students were taught to read and write and received accelerated training and went out in the field. So eventually, some of these first converts and disciples of the missionaries, some will become pastors and evangelists. And the same strategy was used by most mission agencies. So the first type of training, theological training offered by the missionaries in their household and to the household staff was informal and non-formal. That doesn't mean that they didn't know what they were doing. They did. It's only that there was not a specific structure, a specific curriculum, or a diploma at the end. In all cases, the teaching resources used by the missionaries were often limited to the Bible, or the resources they themselves have translated in order to help the populations. In terms of results, one of the main characteristics of the products of these, I call home theological schools, some of the results were that those converts, those first students, were really devoted to the Lord, and they were really full of zeal for evangelization. Needless to say that the missionaries who were sent to Africa belonged to theological traditions which they brought with them. As a logical consequence of their allegiance to their sending organism, they taught new believers according to their own theological and liturgical traditions, and they organized the new founded churches according to their ecclesiastical structures. The theology they taught was developed within their context. Inspired by or influenced by the tabula rasa ideology, many pioneers considered Africans as clean slate on which to write the history of salvation. For most mission agencies and their workers, the urgent task was the salvation of the souls. It is understandable that their focus was on evangelization and church planting. This is not to accuse anyone. I work with primary sources. These are just facts, historical facts. They were product of their own culture, and they did what they could do. With hindsight, we can just see and observe and take note of what happened. So it is important to note that most missionaries of the late 19th and the early 20th centuries were trained ministers and received further preparation before embarking on their missionary work. Most of them did not consider higher theological education as a necessity or a priority. At most, they themselves were holders of Master of Divinity. Maybe more, but I'm not sure. So you can only give what you have. Confronted with the realities on the ground, some missionaries went on to deepen their knowledge of African cultures, either through personal research or by attending seminars. Over the years, commendable efforts have been made to adapt certain aspects of culture, African cultures, to the gospel, songs, music, translations, and so on. We also had some master's theses and maybe PhDs later on. As the number of converts grew, the need to open Bible schools became very clear. In particular, regarding Francophone West Africa, In 1944, the French colony opened up the schools to missionaries to start a catechism school, or just to allow them to educate. That will just be a trigger and encourage many to start French schools, and then there will be an opportunity to send people to Bible schools. So gradually, missions and churches will move from non-formal theological education to a more formal format with the opening of Bible schools. As for the opening of seminaries, for many, this was seen as a luxury that they could not afford at that time. So we can see the progression from this setting at home or on the mission stations, and then with the growth of Christians, the need of opening Bible schools will just present itself. It leads me to the second stage, the formalization of theological education in Francophone Africa. So that's where formal education, theological education begins. Again, the dates are different. I work with some data, so the date I have here is roughly starting in 1930s, the 1930s till mid-1980s. This is Francophone Africa. And I know in West Africa and Central Africa, things are very different. Not to mention even Anglophone Africa. So the numerical growth of the church and the need for Christian leaders led to the opening of the first Bible training centers. Traditionally, Bible schools have always been the basis for training pastors and evangelists in Francophone Africa. The vast majority of church leaders are the product of these Bible schools. So in practice, each denomination has one or more Bible schools. Given the low level of literacy in French, the Bible schools began with teaching in national languages. So I have a table. Some of those Bible schools opened in the early 1936. So later, with the increase of the number of educated people in French, education was offered in French. Each Bible school will characteristically follow the curriculum and the doctrinal line of its founding mission. And then they will just keep on using a standardized curriculum, a kind of copy-paste curriculum from what they've received from the West. So we have theological education in local languages as an important part of theological education, and this is still continuing today. Many churches still have Bible schools in which they train pastors in the languages they know the most. In the first place, in these schools, the first heads of the schools and the first teachers were missionaries. Today, most teachers of these schools have received theological education from seminaries in Africa. So things are a little bit different. But the curriculum is still much like the old days. Due to lack of personnel or staff in many Bible schools, they put together in one place schools or levels that teach in national languages and also the other levels. Many of the schools, Bible schools today, offer a bachelor's degree in theology, which is a very important development in Francophone Africa. Almost every church now has decided in the last couple of years to offer theological education until a bachelor's degree. If you had my chart, I will show you two interesting facts. There were two schools that opened through cooperation. One of the schools is in Abidjan, in Yamoussoukro in Côte d'Ivoire. It started in 1965, called Institut Biblique de l'Alliance Chrétienne de Yamoussoukro. So it started with churches and missions from the CNMA in Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and another mission church called USO, and the Baptist and the Worldwide Evangelical Crusade. And then we have another school called IPH, which was created through a collaborative efforts between churches in Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal, and Guinea, and Ghana, and the DRC also. So these are important aspects that are also interesting. We can learn lessons from that later on. The theological task of missionaries was to translate the message of the gospel into the new host culture. This was a daunting undertaking. Their lack of familiarity with most customs led many to deem numerous aspects of African culture as demonic or immoral and reject them. On the other hand, they did an excellent job in most places in translating the Bible or portions of the Bible into local languages. Theological education in most Bible schools, at least before national teachers were given the leadership of these schools, was thus the reflection of theological education as seen and done in the sending institutions. As mentioned before, the curriculum was almost identical. Doctrine, ecclesiology, Old and New Testament, church history, preaching, pastoral theology, and so on and so forth. Many schools continue to follow the old script, debating questions that are debating in the West, maybe with a local flavor. These subjects are essentially covered from a Western perspective. There hasn't been a revolution regarding curriculum, at least not yet. Another major area that has not undergone much change has to do with textbooks, as we just heard by the moderator this morning. Bible schools, libraries often lack adequate resources. The resources that do exist are often outdated, and most of them deal either with outdated issues or issues that are irrelevant to African Christians. There are some changes, however, in those Bible schools. With the younger generations, those who have been formed in seminaries throughout the continent, there is a desire to move away from those curriculums. And there is a desire that can be seen with some professors to move away from the old curriculum. That leads me to the third point, higher theological education, the halls of higher education, which is the part where I talk about ownership. The history of Protestant and evangelical seminaries and universities dates back to the eve of the formal independence of most African states. That's roughly 100 years after the arrival of the first missionaries in Cameroon, 1844, and 130 years after the arrival of the first missionaries in Benin, 1842. Over the last 30 years, a large number of seminaries have been opened both in West and Central Africa. The proliferation of seminaries is an interesting development in the landscape of theological education in Francophone Africa. Just a few years ago, only some so-called historic churches valued theological education. Many charismatic or revivalist churches were rather reluctant or suspicious of theological education. Let's say theology in general. That has changed in Francophone Africa. Francophone African theologians have been in charge of theological education for quite some time now. They are aware of their responsibilities, and most of them are taking it seriously. And I want to emphasize that most of them are taking their responsibility seriously. According to data gathered through the network of Francophone African theologians, which is called RTAF, there are between 60 and 80 Protestant evangelical seminaries throughout Francophone Africa. The stats are not clear yet, but according to my count, between 60 and 80. And more than 100 people in that network claim the title of doctor in areas such as systematic theology, philosophy, church history, biblical studies, intercultural studies, theology and development, missiology, apologetics, listen, Egyptology, patristic studies, liturgy, linguistic and Bible translation, urban theology, political theology, migration, leadership, pastoral theology, and practical theology. This shows the dynamics going on in Francophone Africa. While in West Africa, the trigger was, in my opinion, the trigger for these schools was the opening of FATEAC, so the school where I come from, in 1993. In Central Africa, the trigger or the tradition of seminaries and universities, Christian universities, dates back to 1959, where the first Christian university was created, called UPC. But in recent years, the enthusiasm is like a wildfire all over Francophone Africa. You can see that. Before 1993, the only evangelical seminary was in the Central African Republic, BEST. Bangui Theological Evangelical Theological School. Traditionally, the DRC, Congo, and to some extent, Cameroon, have led the way in the field of theology across the various Christian traditions, but here mainly the Protestant branch. So these countries, the representatives are here. The DRC, Congo, and Cameroon are really, in many ways, they have been leading the way. Given the growing number of Christians in Francophone Africa and the mushrooming of African-initiated churches and ministries, These collective and individual initiatives are to be welcomed because what I didn't mention is that many of these new seminaries and universities, some are church-owned, but there are individual initiatives. So people who have their PhDs, who have worked in the West, they've decided to open their own seminary or university. So no matter where we come from on that side, these collective or individual initiatives are to be welcomed in the first place because they all seek to respond to specific concerns such as urban missiology, African spiritualities, and so on. In a word, the reasons given by the promoters are the search for relevance, bringing theology into line with contemporary realities. However, this proliferation of Bible schools and seminaries and universities in the Francophone space presents a number of dangers. The race for diplomas, cheap theological education, the fragmentation and the dispersion of human resources, competition between seminaries and Bible schools. And we all know that poorly trained workers mean poorly fed Christians. But we all desire to see well-trained Christian workers who will lead Christians to maturity and oversee healthy churches. Credible associations and organizations are essential to harness forces and capitalize on the available resources in Francophone Africa. So it is fair to say that African theologians are laying claim of ownership on theological education. So now, what are the challenges and the opportunities? In my opinion, collaboration is key for the future of theological education in Africa. Some of the challenges have already been mentioned. The first challenge is the inadequacy of textbooks. There are many theologians who complained about that. The second challenge has to do with the inadequacy of curriculum. There are many also who expressed their frustrations to see that we have inherited curriculums that we are continuing to use, even when there is change in Western seminaries, we still cling on what we have, thinking that it's the best. And maybe 20 years later, we decide to maybe think that, okay, it's time now to move away from that. So there are many colleagues who have complained about that. There is another challenge that is fragmentation in theological schools. It's like those Africa-initiated churches, they are everywhere. And now it's coming to theological education. So we see schools, Bible schools, everywhere. Our opportunities are with the associations that we have. So in the Francophone area, there are three major players in theological education. We have ACTEA in Central Africa. So we have ACTEA, started in the 1970s. So it's been 50 years now. So in Central Africa that we have ACTEA. So this is the Association of Theological Teaching Institutions of Central Africa. In West Africa, we have CETAF, CITAF is the Council of Theological Institutions in Francophone Africa, based in Abidjan, set up in Lomé in 2005, so 15 years ago. We also have RUPA. I heard yes. RUPA is a network of Protestant universities in Africa. That's in Yaoundé. It's been created in 2011. So we have these various associations working to encourage theological institutions. I just want to say a couple of words regarding other actors, players in the field. We have a new movement association called RETAF or ERTAF, an initiation, something initiated by our brother Foley. So it's a WhatsApp group. There are roughly 600 professors, associate professors, pastors, friends of theology who interact in this platform. In the Francophone area, there are also some partners. We have Initiative Francophone, we have Langham Partnership, Scholar Leaders and Tyndall House Foundation. We also have Local Leaders International and Overseas Council. Of course, regarding Langham, we have the imprint Livre Hippo that is trying to help promote and produce resources, academic resources, strong Christian leader resources for Francophone Africa. My conclusion: the future of theological education in Francophone Africa. As I conclude, I stand by what our elders have previously said 40 years ago, in 1980. The future of theological education in Francophone Africa lies in inter-African and inter-church collaboration. The future of theological education in Francophone Africa lies in inter-African and inter-church collaboration. Seminaries and Christian universities in Francophone Africa must break away from the isolationism they have inherited from their founding missions. Additionally, mainline churches and theological institutions need to be more welcoming of Africa-initiated churches that are growing fast and very fast. And in many cases, these are the popular faces of Christianity in our region. In some cases, opening up to the wider Christian community may entail renaming or relabeling the name of seminaries or universities that we have. The major players operating in the field have each their own expertise, which they offer to seminaries and universities. The missions they have set themselves are aimed at finding answers to challenges that we have mentioned, namely contextualizing curriculum, training and keeping track of teachers' careers, facilitating teacher mobility, stimulating scientific research through the production and publication of knowledge, computerizing and connecting libraries, improving governance in seminaries and universities. If Francophone African theologians and researchers are not to miss out the realities of African Christians and the needs of the church in Francophone Africa, they would be wise not to fall into the trap of specialization so dear to the West. Our doctoral studies in our seminaries should emphasize interdisciplinarity. This is my third inter. Inter-African, inter-church, interdisciplinarity. While we still have to recognize the place of specialties. But in Africa, if you are a doctor, a pastor, you are good for everything. So it's better to prepare people for that. So African Francophone theologians can no longer afford the luxury of ignoring the rich anthropological and sociological data made available to them by their African colleagues in these sciences. Most of the time, biblical scholars in particular, they ignore the social science data. And we cannot move forward if we just close our eyes. We have so much richness available. It goes without saying that in a digitalized world, distance learning and the use of new technologies in theological education in Francophone Africa are key factors that must be taken into account. Finally, in order for Francophone theological education to be relevant, African Francophone theologians must have the courage to break away from the structures of thought and the schemes inherited from Western faculties and dare to propose another agenda that takes into account the realities of Christians and the needs of the church in Africa. If we do that, the next stage or the next chapter that I may come someday to talk about will be the flourishing of theological education in Francophone Africa. Thank you for listening.